You wake up tired even after a full night in bed, your mind foggy, your cravings louder, and your blood sugar numbers more unpredictable than you expected, and you start to wonder why nothing seems to be changing despite your effort. What if the missing piece is not another supplement or stricter diet, but a simple 90-minute window before sleep that quietly shifts your metabolism by up to 20%? Tonight, we are uncovering the night habit people cannot stop talking about, and why it may be the reset your body has been waiting for. Most people assume that metabolism simply slows down with age, or that weight gain and unstable blood sugar are inevitable consequences of getting older. But what often goes unnoticed is that metabolism follows a daily rhythm that is tightly controlled by your internal clock and profoundly influenced by what happens in the evening hours. Your body does not process food, release hormones, or burn fuel at the same efficiency at 10 in the morning as it does at 10 at night, and this shift is not random but driven by circadian biology that has been mapped in detail by modern research. Throughout the day, insulin sensitivity rises and falls in a predictable pattern, typically peaking earlier in the day and gradually declining as evening approaches, which means the same meal eaten at night produces a higher and more prolonged blood sugar response than it would in the morning. Controlled laboratory studies have shown that identical calorie intake consumed later in the day results in greater glucose excursions and reduced metabolic efficiency compared to earlier consumption, even when physical activity and total calories remain constant. This phenomenon is not about willpower or discipline, but about cellular timing, because your muscle cells, liver, and pancreas respond differently depending on the biological hour. As the evening progresses, melatonin levels begin to rise in preparation for sleep, and this hormone does more than regulate drowsiness because it also interacts with pancreatic beta cells that secrete insulin. When melatonin increases, insulin secretion becomes less efficient, which means late-night eating occurs at a time when the body is biologically less prepared to manage glucose effectively. Research published in Metabolic and Endocrinology journals has demonstrated that elevated melatonin combined with food intake can impair glucose tolerance, leading to higher overnight blood sugar levels and reduced fat oxidation. At the same time, resting metabolic rate subtly declines as part of the body's preparation for repair and recovery, and this is where the problem begins for many people who eat, stimulate their brain with bright screens, or remain mentally stressed late into the night. When insulin remains elevated because of late food intake and cortisol remains elevated because of stress or stimulation, the body shifts away from fat burning and towards storage, even if total daily calories are not excessive. Over weeks and months, this mismatch between biological rhythm and behavior contributes to creeping insulin resistance, morning fatigue, and a sense that metabolism is working against you. What makes this particularly important is that studies using continuous glucose monitoring have shown that evening behaviors can significantly alter next morning fasting glucose and overall glucose variability, which are key markers of metabolic health. In other words, the numbers you see when you wake up are not only determined by what you ate during the day, but by how your body was signaled during the final hours before sleep. When those signals align with circadian biology, the body transitions smoothly into an overnight state of growth hormone release, tissue repair, and fat utilization. When those signals conflict with biology, the body remains in a semi-activated metabolic state that impairs recovery and promotes instability. This is why the final 90 minutes before bed represent a biologically sensitive window rather than a neutral stretch of time, because the hormonal environment during this period determines whether you enter sleep with low insulin, rising melatonin, and balanced cortisol, or with competing signals that confuse metabolic pathways. Growth hormone, which plays a role in fat metabolism and cellular repair, is primarily released during early deep sleep, and its effectiveness depends on the metabolic context established before you close your eyes. Elevated insulin levels blunt this process, while stable glucose and reduced stress enhance it. When you begin to understand that metabolism is rhythmic rather than static, you see that the evening is not simply the end of the day, but a metabolic crossroads where small choices produce measurable differences in overnight physiology. This is the foundation of the 90-minute reset window, because before we discuss specific habits, we must first recognize that the body is not malfunctioning but responding precisely to the timing cues it receives. Once you see the pattern, the opportunity becomes clear, and the night transforms from a passive period into a powerful lever for metabolic change. If the evening represents a metabolic crossroads, then the final 90 minutes before sleep function as a control panel, where multiple biological systems either synchronize for recovery or remain misaligned in a way that quietly disrupts glucose control and fat metabolism. This reset window is not built around extreme routines or complicated biohacks, but around four tightly connected elements that research consistently shows influence nighttime insulin sensitivity and hormonal balance: light exposure, meal timing, gentle movement, and nervous system regulation. The first component is meal timing, because the digestive system does not simply switch off at night, yet its efficiency clearly declines as melatonin rises and insulin responsiveness decreases. Clinical trials comparing early and late eating patterns demonstrate that consuming the final meal at least 2 to 3 hours before sleep significantly improves overnight glucose stability and next morning fasting levels compared to eating within an hour of bedtime. When food is introduced too close to sleep, insulin remains elevated during a period when the body is preparing to release growth hormone, and this hormonal overlap reduces the natural shift toward fat oxidation that normally occurs in the first cycles of deep sleep. The second component involves light exposure, particularly artificial blue light emitted from phones, tablets, and overhead lighting that signals wakefulness to the brain long after sunset. Studies using controlled light environments show that exposure to bright or blue-enriched light in the late evening suppresses melatonin production, delays sleep onset, and alters glucose metabolism the following morning. When melatonin release is delayed, the timing of insulin modulation is also affected, creating a mismatch between circadian rhythm and metabolic signaling that can increase insulin resistance over time. The third component is light movement after dinner, which serves as a direct signal to skeletal muscle cells that circulating glucose should be absorbed and used rather than stored. Research demonstrates that even 10 to 15 minutes of low-intensity walking after a meal can significantly blunt postprandial glucose spikes, improving glycemic control without increasing overall exercise stress. Muscle contraction stimulates glucose transporter activity independently of insulin, which means this gentle movement reduces the insulin demand required to clear glucose from the bloodstream and sets a more stable metabolic baseline before sleep. The fourth component focuses on nervous system regulation, because cortisol levels that remain elevated in the evening interfere with both insulin sensitivity and sleep architecture, psychological stress. Stimulating media and late-night work can keep the sympathetic nervous system activated, preventing the natural decline in cortisol that should occur before sleep. Controlled breathing practices, low-stimulation routines, and structured wind-down rituals have been shown to reduce sympathetic activation, lower heart rate variability imbalance, and support a smoother transition into restorative sleep cycles. When these four elements are aligned within the 90-minute window, the body receives a coordinated message that the active phase of the day has ended and the repair phase is beginning. Insulin levels fall appropriately, melatonin rises on schedule, cortisol declines, and muscle tissue has already assisted in glucose clearance through movement. This synchronized hormonal environment allows growth hormone to be released efficiently during early sleep, which supports fat metabolism, tissue repair, and improved metabolic flexibility. The reason some individuals observe improvements, approaching 20% in glucose variability or overnight metabolic markers, is not because the body suddenly accelerates beyond its natural limits, but because these small adjustments remove friction that was previously interfering with biological rhythm. Continuous glucose monitoring studies reveal that stabilizing evening inputs can reduce overnight glucose swings and improve time in range, which are measurable and clinically meaningful markers of metabolic health. The 90-minute reset window therefore operates as a precision alignment strategy rather than a dramatic intervention, because it works by restoring the natural sequence of hormonal events that are already programmed into human physiology. When meal timing, light exposure, gentle movement, and stress reduction are intentionally structured within this window, the metabolic system transitions into sleep in a state that favors stability, fat utilization, and improved next morning glucose response. After dinner, most people sit down, scroll through a screen, or remain largely sedentary, unaware that this short window represents one of the most powerful opportunities to influence blood sugar control and overnight fat metabolism. The human body was designed to move after eating because skeletal muscle acts as a dynamic reservoir for glucose, and even light contractions signal cells to absorb circulating sugar efficiently without demanding large amounts of insulin. When we remain still after a meal, glucose lingers in the bloodstream longer, requiring greater insulin release and creating a hormonal environment that favors storage rather than utilization. Multiple clinical studies have demonstrated that brief bouts of low-intensity movement performed within 30 minutes after eating significantly reduce post-meal glucose spikes compared to complete rest. This effect has been observed in healthy adults as well as individuals with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, indicating that muscle contraction provides a powerful glucose-lowering effect independent of baseline metabolic status. The mechanism is well understood because muscle contraction activates intracellular pathways that move glucose transporters to the cell surface, allowing sugar to enter muscle cells even when insulin signaling is not optimal. What makes this particularly important in the evening is the natural decline in insulin sensitivity that occurs as part of circadian rhythm biology, which means that the same carbohydrate load requires more insulin at night than it would earlier in the day. By introducing gentle walking, light cycling, or simple bodyweight movements after dinner, you effectively reduce the insulin burden placed on the pancreas during a biologically vulnerable period. Over time, this repeated reduction in postprandial glucose excursions improves overall glycemic variability, which is increasingly recognized as a key marker of metabolic health beyond simple fasting glucose. Measurements. Research using continuous glucose monitoring devices has shown that even 10 to 15 minutes of slow walking after dinner can reduce peak glucose levels by meaningful margins and shorten the duration of elevated blood sugar exposure. When glucose spikes are blunted, less insulin is required to restore baseline levels, and lower insulin during the pre-sleep period supports a smoother transition into overnight fat oxidation. This is not about burning hundreds of calories in a short session, but about altering hormonal context in a way that improves metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility refers to the body's ability to switch between carbohydrate and fat as fuel sources depending on availability and hormonal signals. Elevated insulin levels suppress fat breakdown, while lower insulin combined with stable glucose allows stored fat to be mobilized and used during sleep. When evening movement lowers post-meal glucose and reduces insulin demand, the body enters the first sleep cycles in a state that is more favorable for fat utilization rather than continued storage. Additionally, post-dinner movement improves glycogen storage within muscle tissue, which reduces the likelihood that excess glucose will remain circulating overnight. Muscle glycogen acts as a buffer system, absorbing incoming glucose and stabilizing blood sugar levels without requiring excessive pancreatic output. Over repeated nights, this pattern supports improved insulin sensitivity because tissues are consistently exposed to lower glucose and insulin levels. Importantly, the intensity of this movement does not need to be strenuous, and in fact, excessively intense exercise too close to bedtime may elevate cortisol and interfere with sleep onset. The most effective strategy is controlled, low-intensity activity that elevates heart rate modestly while maintaining calm breathing and relaxed mental focus. This approach activates skeletal muscle pathways without triggering stress, responses that could counteract the metabolic benefits. When integrated consistently into the 90-minute reset window, gentle evening movement becomes a precision tool that shifts glucose handling, reduces insulin demand, and enhances the hormonal environment required for efficient overnight fat burning. The cumulative effect may contribute to measurable improvements in glucose stability and metabolic efficiency that approach the 20% range referenced earlier, not because of dramatic calorie expenditure, but because of strategic timing that aligns muscle activity with circadian biology. Most people think of light as something that helps them see, but from a physiological perspective, light is one of the most powerful metabolic signals the body receives, especially during the final hours before sleep. The human brain contains specialized cells in the retina that detect changes in brightness and wavelength, and these cells communicate directly with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock that coordinates circadian rhythm throughout the entire body. When bright artificial light remains present late into the evening, this clock interprets the signal as daytime, even if the wall clock says otherwise. Melatonin, often called the sleep hormone, begins rising naturally in dim light conditions, and its increase is a critical signal that the body is shifting from an active metabolic state toward repair and recovery. However, exposure to blue-enriched light from phones, tablets, televisions, and overhead LED lighting suppresses melatonin production and delays its onset, effectively pushing the biological night later than intended. Controlled laboratory experiments have demonstrated that even moderate light exposure in the late evening can significantly reduce melatonin levels and alter the timing of its release. What is less widely understood is that melatonin interacts directly with pancreatic beta cells, influencing insulin secretion and glucose regulation during the night. Research in endocrinology has shown that higher melatonin levels are associated with reduced insulin release, which makes biological sense because food intake should be minimal during the natural sleep phase. When bright light suppresses melatonin while food is still being processed or insulin remains elevated, the coordination between these systems becomes disrupted. Several studies have found that individuals exposed to bright light at night exhibit impaired glucose tolerance the following morning compared to those kept in dim light conditions. In controlled trials where participants were placed in low-light environments for several hours before bed, fasting glucose and insulin sensitivity markers improved compared to nights with standard household lighting. These findings suggest that light exposure alone, independent of calorie intake, can meaningfully influence metabolic function. The mechanism behind this effect involves more than melatonin suppression because circadian misalignment affects liver glucose production, peripheral insulin sensitivity, and the timing of hormonal cascades that regulate energy balance. When the internal clock receives conflicting signals such as darkness outside but bright light indoors, peripheral tissues may not synchronize properly with central circadian cues. This desynchronization contributes to higher nocturnal glucose levels and reduced metabolic efficiency over time. Dimming lights during the final 90 minutes before sleep sends a clear biological message that night has arrived, allowing melatonin to rise naturally and coordinate with declining cortisol levels. As melatonin increases in a predictable rhythm, insulin secretion is appropriately modulated, and the body prepares to transition into deep sleep stages where growth hormone release supports fat metabolism and tissue repair. This synchronized sequence depends heavily on environmental light cues, which means that modern lighting habits can either reinforce or disrupt metabolic health. Importantly, the goal is not complete darkness immediately after dinner, but a gradual reduction in light intensity and a shift toward warmer light tones that mimic sunset conditions. Reducing screen exposure, lowering overhead brightness, and using softer ambient lighting can significantly decrease blue light exposure without requiring extreme measures. These adjustments allow the brain to interpret the environment as evening, restoring the natural cascade of hormonal events that prepare the body for restorative sleep. When light exposure is optimized within the 90-minute reset window, the metabolic system enters sleep with properly timed melatonin release, balanced insulin dynamics, and improved next morning glucose stability. Over time, this alignment strengthens circadian rhythm consistency, which has been associated in population studies with lower risk of metabolic syndrome and improved long-term glycemic control. In this way, light becomes more than a visual tool because it acts as a master regulator of metabolic timing that can either undermine or enhance the very processes we rely on for overnight recovery. While food timing and light exposure shape the hormonal landscape of the evening, stress physiology may be the most underestimated factor influencing whether the body shifts into repair mode or remains metabolically defensive throughout the night. Cortisol, often referred to as the primary stress hormone, follows a natural rhythm that peaks in the early morning and gradually declines toward bedtime, preparing the body for restorative sleep and metabolic recalibration. When psychological stimulation, unresolved work demands, intense media consumption, or emotional rumination persist into the late evening, cortisol levels can remain elevated at a time when they should be falling. Elevated evening cortisol has direct metabolic consequences because it increases hepatic glucose production, reduces peripheral insulin sensitivity, and promotes the mobilization of stored energy in a way that favors short-term survival rather than long-term repair. In practical terms, this means the liver releases more glucose into the bloodstream during the night, even when food intake has stopped, leading to higher fasting glucose levels the following morning. Studies examining individuals under chronic stress show consistent patterns of impaired glucose tolerance, increased abdominal fat deposition, and disrupted sleep architecture. The relationship between cortisol and insulin is particularly important during the final 90 minutes before sleep, because these hormones exert opposing influences on metabolic pathways. Insulin works to store glucose and reduce circulating sugar, while cortisol signals the body to release energy into the bloodstream in preparation for perceived demand. When cortisol remains elevated in the evening, insulin signaling becomes less efficient, requiring greater insulin output to achieve the same glucose-lowering effect. Beyond glucose regulation, persistent evening stress alters the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic system prepares the body for action by increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness, while the parasympathetic system supports digestion, recovery, and cellular repair. For optimal metabolic transition into sleep, the parasympathetic system should gradually dominate during the evening hours, allowing heart rate to slow and inflammatory signaling to decrease. Research using heart rate variability monitoring has shown that structured relaxation practices can measurably increase parasympathetic activity within minutes, indicating a shift toward a more restorative physiological state. Techniques such as slow diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and guided reflection have been associated with reductions in evening cortisol and improvements in sleep onset latency. In clinical populations, these interventions have also demonstrated modest but meaningful improvements in fasting glucose and overall glycemic stability. The mechanism underlying these benefits involves decreased activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs cortisol release in response to perceived stress. When cognitive stimulation is reduced and breathing becomes slow and rhythmic, signals to the hypothalamus diminish, leading to lower cortisol output and a smoother decline toward baseline levels. This hormonal recalibration supports improved insulin sensitivity during the early phases of sleep and enhances the conditions necessary for growth hormone secretion. It is important to understand that the nervous system does not distinguish between a real physical threat and an emotionally charged news headline, because both activate similar stress pathways within the brain. Late-night exposure to stimulating content, heated conversations, or unresolved mental planning can therefore sustain cortisol elevation long after the external stimulus has ended. Over time, this repeated pattern contributes to chronic metabolic strain that may manifest as morning fatigue, unstable blood sugar, or difficulty losing weight despite disciplined habits. Integrating intentional nervous system downregulation into the 90-minute reset window creates a clear biological signal that the day is complete and recovery can begin. When cortisol declines appropriately, insulin sensitivity improves, hepatic glucose output stabilizes, and the body enters deep sleep stages with a hormonal environment optimized for repair rather than defense. This alignment between psychological state and metabolic function represents a powerful but often overlooked lever for improving overnight physiology and long-term metabolic resilience. When people hear the phrase 20% improvement, it can sound exaggerated or vague, so it is important to clarify exactly what that number represents in physiological terms rather than marketing language. In clinical and observational research examining evening behavioral adjustments, improvements approaching 20% have been observed in measures such as postprandial glucose area under the curve, overnight glucose variability, and time spent within optimal glycemic range. These are not abstract metrics but concrete indicators of how stable and efficient your metabolism is across the night. For example, continuous glucose monitoring studies show that when late eating is reduced, post-dinner walking is introduced, evening light exposure is dimmed, and stress is actively lowered, peak glucose values can decline significantly and remain elevated for shorter durations. In some participants, this translates into reductions in overall glucose exposure of 15 to 20%, compared to baseline patterns that included late meals and bright light. Even modest reductions in glucose variability are associated with improved insulin sensitivity and reduced long-term risk of metabolic disease. It is also critical to understand that this improvement does not mean your metabolism suddenly accelerates by 20% across all functions, nor does it guarantee dramatic weight loss in a matter of days. Instead, it reflects improved metabolic flexibility, which is the ability of your body to switch between carbohydrate and fat as fuel without excessive hormonal strain. When insulin levels fall appropriately before sleep and glucose remains stable, the body enters deep sleep cycles in a more metabolically efficient state that supports fat oxidation and tissue repair. The individuals who tend to benefit most from this structured 90-minute reset are adults over 40, people experiencing mild insulin resistance, those with elevated fasting glucose, and individuals reporting poor sleep quality. As insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age and circadian rhythms become more fragile, evening behaviors exert a stronger influence on next morning metabolic markers. In these populations, aligning light exposure, movement, meal timing, and stress regulation can produce measurable changes within weeks rather than months. Research in sleep medicine and metabolic physiology consistently shows that improved sleep architecture enhances insulin sensitivity the following day, reduces appetite-regulating hormone disruption, and stabilizes energy levels. When deep sleep increases and nighttime awakenings decrease, growth hormone release becomes more robust and inflammatory signaling declines. These shifts contribute to better glucose handling and reduced cravings, creating a positive feedback loop that reinforces healthy behavior. To implement the protocols safely and consistently, begin by finishing your final meal at least 2 to 3 hours before bed and avoiding additional caloric intake afterward. Within 30 minutes of dinner, engage in 10 to 15 minutes of light movement that feels sustainable and calm rather than intense or exhausting. As bedtime approaches, dim household lighting, reduce screen exposure, and shift toward warmer light tones that signal biological night to the brain. During the final segment of the 90-minute window, practice deliberate nervous system downregulation through slow breathing, gentle stretching, or reflective journaling that lowers cognitive stimulation. These steps may appear simple, yet their power lies in timing and repetition rather than complexity. When performed consistently, they restore alignment between circadian rhythm and metabolic signaling, allowing hormones to rise and fall in the sequence they were designed to follow. Over time, this alignment strengthens insulin sensitivity, stabilizes overnight glucose patterns, and improves morning energy without the need for extreme interventions. If you have existing medical conditions or are taking glucose-lowering medications, consult your healthcare provider before making significant changes to meal timing or physical activity patterns, because individual needs vary. However, for many adults seeking improved metabolic stability, the 90-minute reset window offers a practical, evidence-based strategy grounded in physiology rather than trends. Tonight, instead of asking whether your metabolism is broken, consider whether its timing has been disrupted by modern habits that conflict with biological design. Small, deliberate adjustments during the final 90 minutes before sleep can reshape the hormonal environment that governs overnight recovery. When you respect the clock built into your cells, you give your body the conditions it needs to perform at its best, and that is where measurable change begins.